Well, it looks like we've been waiting for parts again, haven't we? And for me, waiting is absolutely the hardest part of the whole car building process. But I guess, given our end goal and what we just did in regards to the TT, waiting kinda makes sense. We spent time going through yet another design phase in our big turbo build. And in that phase, we came up with ideas for the intake, the charge pipe, and the downpipe. We ordered the parts we thought we needed, and so long as we did a good job in the design phase, assembling these with the parts should be easy. And with the passage of time, these parts should already be here. So today, I'm on my way to make some progress. And I'd go so far as to say, we're on the home stretch now. For me, life has been rather busy lately. Things have cropped up, pulling my attention away from what I really should spend it on. Distractions, both good and bad, making things difficult, but not impossible. We've been going back and forth between waiting for parts and working on the car, inching forward and standing still. Yet today, progress will speed up rapidly.
We left off with the downpipe, and that's the part where most of the work needs to be done.
The downpipe was a bit of an unknown. Our loose plan for how it should go involved combining the top half of a GTI downpipe with the bottom half of the current downpipe.
We had just cut the GTI downpipe as well as the 225 downpipe to see what kind of clearance we were going to work with. And it turns out we were really close.
And if you remember, the reason this downpipe is such a big unknown is I've never welded before. So right about then is where my friend came over to help.
And our plan was to effectively take a bunch of different pie cuts, get them as close as we could, and tack them together until we had the downpipe modified to the point where we could remove it and install it with no fitment issues.
And then he would take our tack welded downpipe back to his shop where he could actually weld it for real. But right now, the main goal was to effectively create the downpipe through a bunch of pie cuts. The first thing we did was slide a couple into place, realizing we needed a little bit more clearance, so we took some length off of the GTI downpipe. And from here, we could actually start fitting the pie cuts. Now, sadly, it wasn't quite as simple as just connecting the two pipes. We needed to ensure that this downpipe sat as far away as possible from the prop shaft. That is going to be our biggest clearance issue. So when we were making this, we taped it up such that it had more clearance than we realistically needed. So we did this a couple times. We only really get a couple shots at making this right before we should have just done it from scratch. We ended up giving ourselves just a little bit more clearance on the 225 downpipe and coming across a pie cut combination that we were starting to be rather happy with. It's a 3-inch downpipe all the way back from the turbo, using stainless steel. And honestly, there's only a couple pie cuts we really needed. The process for testing this, though, is rather interesting. It would be pretty dumb to weld every single pie cut together at the same time and test them all at once. That's not very smart, because if we messed up, we wouldn't be able to tell which one needed adjusting. So instead, we went 1 or 2 at a time, making sure that the fitment was still something we were happy with between each and every weld we made. Using a combination of markers and tape allowed us to ensure that the orientation of each of these pieces was maintained between adjustments. Time passed on, and with each weld, our downpipe was getting longer until we really only had 2 pieces, the top half and the bottom half. So in other words, this was the final test before we welded the downpipe completely. And shockingly, this was going very smoothly. We lined it up and tacked it on the car this time, mostly just to make sure that we knew where it was supposed to be. Then, after we got everything out of the car, we tacked it up for real. And this was the final tack-welded rendition of the downpipe, the shape needed to effectively connect the O2 pipe to the exhaust. And to say I was nervous during this fitment was a complete understatement. If this didn't work, we would have to go back to the drawing board. But that's the funny thing. It seems in this case, I was worried for no reason at all. Not only did the downpipe fit with plenty of clearance, but it even bolted up directly to the O2 pipe, meaning the biggest mystery for this build was actually coming to a close. But how close was it to our original theory? Well, on this one, looks like we did a good job designing it. It looks pretty much exactly like we planned. give or take a little bit of clearance. And with that, I sent the downpipe off to him so he could finish welding it for real. I also asked him to add a secondary O2 sensor port, but that's for later.
As far as the intake goes, where we left off was with a simple design.
Building an intake from scratch is a lot easier than building a downpipe. Not a lot of welding, really just a lot of finding parts that might work. And I ordered a ton. With this not-so-random collection of aluminum and silicone, we should be good to start assembling our intake. And what that really entails at first is simply mocking up the parts to see what the clearance is going to look like. And remember, the biggest unknown here is how we're going to add all of those ports. And thankfully, I found this pretty interesting kit online that I think we're going to be able to use. We are effectively going to be making the ports in this aluminum pipe. And the kit includes hole saws cut to a specific size to fit different grommets. And the grommets come in different sizes depending on what you're actually trying to install. In this case, a post-MAF return for our catch can. These are pressure-fit grommets, and really they are difficult to press in. So in all honesty, very little air should be escaping from this. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a perfect seal for perfect vacuum, but since this is an intake, it doesn't necessarily need to be. There's also going to be no positive pressure. I also purchased this coupler which has a provision for the diverter valve. We're going to need that too. And the current plan is to effectively just add the rest of the ports to the aluminum. And we really only need two more. One small one for the N75 and another for the brake booster. And one of the benefits of this being an early model 1.8 is there's not too many ports we really need to add. Just these four. The MAF is also the best way the car understands how much air it's getting and its fueling, so we're not going to go with a MAF-less setup. I want this turbo setup to be similar to how an OEM one would be ran, however a much more efficient system overall. And with the final grommet in place, you can see the three biggest unknowns for the intake routed. All of these will be post-MAF, so our airflow should be accurate. And we're even going to include the diverter valve back here, so in theory our intake system will mimic exactly what the original turbo inlet pipe was.
We were running into a bit of an issue. Our heat shield was at kind of a weird angle, and with the 45 and the 90, we were going to have to modify it pretty substantially in order to get it to fit. So I figured we would take our mass airflow sensor off of that and use it as an additional coupler between the diverter valve coupler and the 90. Then we just run the cone filter on the end of the 90 and we're good to go.
It sucks that we can't exactly use this heat shield as is, but the benefit is we know where it mounts, so it's actually going to be rather easy to design our own, and I think we definitely should in the future. The cool thing about this though is the cone filter is now just about as far away in the engine bay you can get from the engine. Not a true cold air intake, but much better than just running it right by the side of the block. And the black looks a lot better than the red. Obviously, this isn't the perfect intake. One way to dramatically simplify this would be to just have the entire thing made out of silicone like the original turbo inlet pipe, but that is a much longer process. We'd have to make a mold and have that sent off to be made. For the time being, this is going to be more than ample to get the car started and running. Plus, we can always improve it in the future.
Now that we've got the downpipe taken care of, air is coming out of the turbo. Air is also coming in since we have the intake. We need to get this charged air through the intercooler and into the inlet of the engine though. And to do that, we need our charge pipe.
The charge pipe design was quite possibly the simplest out of all three. It actually started just as one piece.
Our charge pipe design effectively needed to have ports for an N75 and a diverter valve. Those are pretty simple.
And rather than making this all hodgepodge like the intake, I decided to use what was available. Forge makes an aluminum charge pipe for the 225. It's already the right size and shape and includes the provisions for the N75 and the diverter valve. Plus the look matches the intake. So rather than spending a lot of money on a nice one, I bought one that was used. That way we can use this as a basis for our design, get the benefit of it already looking good, and then we'll be good to go from there.
Only one issue. This doesn't exactly fit with the size of the turbo and the location, so we need to make some modifications, hence why I got it used. That way I didn't feel too bad chopping it in half.
Setting it here, you can see exactly what I was talking about in the last episode when we made all these measurements. The top half that moves towards the turbo is too long. It has to be shortened about 4 or 5 inches. And thankfully, we measured this last week, so we can get straight to cutting. And even just with one of the cuts made, you can see how I ideally want this to be sitting. We don't want to kink up the silicone, so we need to shorten this. But other than that, it should be able to reuse most of the mounts that the original charge pipe had. Another win. So with the second cut made, we can put everything back in place and see what the fitment is going to look like. And it looks like we did a pretty good job. All we need is the silicone to join them, right?
Only one real issue. Since this air is holding a lot of pressure, likely quite a few PSI, those hose clamps are simply going to blow off unless there's something to hold onto. That's where bead rolling comes in.
Ah yes, bead rolling. The ends of these pipes are flush, so if we put a hose clamp on them, they would quite simply just be blown off by the pressure. The other end of this pipe has a little lip on it, a bead, if you will. This end is bead roll, and that's gonna hold a hose clamp in place. So how do we do that to this side then? Well, since this pipe is aluminum, which we can verify by testing if it's ferrous, that means it is an incredibly soft metal. In other words, we can bead roll the end of this by hand. And with just a little bit of money on eBay, you can get yourself a cheap bead rolling tool. I figured this isn't the last time I'm going to be bead rolling pipes, especially considering other turbo projects I have planned. This was definitely a worthwhile purchase. It's really just a little device that pinches the end of a pipe and rolls it along its edge to produce that bead rolling lip. You could toss this in a vise, or you could straight up just stand on it. This metal is seriously soft enough that you don't have to apply hardly any force in order to get this effect. And for how cheap this kit was, I was pretty thrilled with how it was looking. All we had to do was replicate it on the other half of the pipe.
Sure, I could have done this a lot more professionally and not just stood on it, but the way I did it goes to show you that you can do this pretty much anywhere, and it's actually not nearly that hard. The only thing you need to ensure is that it's aluminum. I'm assuming this would probably work for stainless, but it would take a lot more pressure and you would absolutely need a vise. Aluminum is incredibly soft though. And this gets our charge pipe pretty much exactly where I wanted to and validates the design I had.
Here you can see the lips after they have been bead rolled, and they look pretty similar to the end of this pipe. Pretty cool for such a cheap tool. I've also already got the silicone to connect the two, meaning we're ready to start running all the vacuum lines in the engine bay again.
With that, all of our airflow systems are pretty much exactly where I want them to be. However, the bay looks like a complete rat's nest.
And if you're well versed in the world of the 1.8, you know exactly how we can make it just a little better. The N249 system makes a lot of sense on a stock car. It doesn't really make sense to delete it if it's working. However, this car is far from stock, and the turbo I'm running never really had one on the car it originally came on. So we might as well delete it, making the engine bay look that much nicer. It's also really easy to delete. You can run a vacuum line straight from the top of the diverter valve to the intake manifold, and then cap off the end of the sensor that is also connected to the N249. And on a stock car, that one's under the intake manifold. And with 5 minutes of effort, the bay is a lot less prone to leaks. One more thing you've got to do though. The N249 is connected electrically, and they make resistors which can just defeat that signal. Pretty cheap and pretty sweet. You're also going to notice something really cool about the way I designed the bay. Since the car is so heavily inspired by the OEM engine, I was able to reuse a lot of the OEM silicone, including the two pieces that came off of the charge pipe and headed towards the N75 and the diverter valve, which is super cool. It looks a lot better, and crazy enough, once we get the downpipe and put some hose clamps on, the engine's kinda good to go.
However, the turbo is going to be very, very hot unless we run the lines needed to cool it. Namely, we need to run the oil and water lines. And thankfully, I bought a kit that allegedly should work, though we might need to modify it a little bit.
Despite being so close, we've got to take everything off once again. This time to start a project on the turbo that isn't exactly related to the boost system. This one is entirely fluid-based. So in order to put these lines on, we need to be able to see the turbo. And looking at the turbo, you might notice something, or at least I did. Something is off here. The ports on the turbo weren't exactly making sense to me. I compared it with the reference diagram that I got when I bought the turbo, and I was right. The whole turbo is actually upside down. So in other words, before we can run the lines, we got some work to do. With the turbo out of the car, you can see that there are 4 ports on it, and there are 4 lines that need to run in and out of the turbo. On either side are 2 matching threaded holes, and these are actually for coolant. And for coolant, it doesn't matter which one goes where. Oil, however, it does. You'll notice the oil feed and the oil drain are completely different. The oil feed is pressurized and the oil drain is gravity fed. And currently the oil drain is on top. So we need to clock the entire turbo 180 degrees so it is exactly reverse of what it is now. And thankfully that's a pretty easy process. You really just undo the bolts holding each side of the housing on and you can rotate the whole thing. And for this turbo, the oil drain needs to be pointed pretty much directly down, give or take 15 degrees of tolerance. I tossed the turbo back on the car so I could mock up and make sure the clocking was right, and then I went through and I torqued down each of the bolts. And since you want this to be an airtight seal, when you tighten it, use a star pattern. We'll go through and double check all the torque at the very end, but for now, this is a lot better. And now we can actually start running the lines for the turbo. The only issue is the kit came with absolutely no instructions. Nothing was labeled. It's all just a collection of pieces, different AN fittings, different lines, different banjo bolts that we have to reverse engineer in order to get fitted to the car. The only thing we have going for us is this kit is designed for a top mount GT28 RS on a 1.8T, so everything should be the right size. We just need to figure out where it goes. And the first thing I started with was the oil drain. We can tell the oil parts apart from the coolant parts because the coolant parts are identical, so anything that's paired likely has to go with coolant. The oil drain, however, has a flange that goes onto the turbo and then it runs into a little coupler, which is then connected to a rubber line they supplied. Though I'm gonna swap the rubber out with silicone because I don't really want to deal with that. Taking a break from the drain, we need to go back to the engine. We still haven't removed the oil feed line for the turbo. It is on the oil filter housing right here. And using one of those fancy ball end Allen sockets, we can remove it. And this will give us enough clearance to remove the entire line. From here, we can replace this banjo bolt with this adapter bolt instead. Both have the same bottom fitting so they won't leak. However, this new style routes to a 90-degree fitting instead. But the good news is it threads in just the same. And with that installed, we can run the 90-degree adapter into the threaded braided metal line that should connect to the top of the turbo. And here's where things get cool. This line fits to the top of the turbo perfectly. And if we route it to the right of the intake outlet, it'll actually slide down into the perfect orientation to connect to the oil feed on the engine. In other words, a pretty good sign that this kit is going to actually fit. And with it tightened and connected, we can move on to the oil drain, which is back under the car. The gravity-fed portion connected to the bottom of the turbo, and this other half effectively looks the same. And it's gonna go right to the oil pan. It comes with a gasket, an adapter, and a little flange so that we can run a hose between the oil drain on the turbo and right here. Pretty simple, though I do suggest replacing the rubber hose they supply you with silicone or metal if you can. Definitely don't want to deal with that since this area is so hot. And the coolant lines are actually the easiest part. Each side is connected with a banjo bolt into the turbo. And from here, we effectively just need to run one of these to the original coolant line and the other one to the coolant line into the block. One of the coolant lines can thread into this little hose adapter right here, which we are simply going to shove into the original coolant supply line for the turbo. If we cut the line right before it turns into a metal hard line, we can simply shove this piece in and tighten it down with a hose clamp. Pretty nifty. And what I'm doing right here is adding the banjo bolt on the other side of the turbo. This is for the outlet of the coolant, and this one threads exactly into the block, right where we removed the old coolant line. And you guessed it, just like the old one, it's another banjo bolt. Pretty simple design, and thankfully all of these lines fit.
It took me a little bit, but I did eventually find all the routing needed in order to get the turbo set up. I haven't driven this car in quite a long time, and I am very excited. Effectively, all we have left to do is take it all apart, apply some heat wrapping to a number of places, make sure there's no clearance issues, and reinstall everything for the final time. With every single gasket we need, all of the thread locker if we need it, as well as making sure everything is torqued down properly. And then, finally, we will be ready to drive this car again. And I really hope this goes to plan.
If this turbo build was a tunnel, I feel like we are finally starting to see light at the end of it. Now, I don't want to jinx myself or anything, but in theory, the list of things we have to do is pretty small now. So really, as soon as the downpipe is back in my hands and everything is properly installed, we'll be on the stage of tuning and priming the turbo, and I am absolutely thrilled. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. That's the best way you can help support me and my content. I also wanted to take time to announce that I'm going to start doing some special feature episodes. They will be in addition to the current episodes and will be about something different every single time. Likely different formats too. Creative world building, short films, really whatever I feel like making. I'll talk about it more later, but the first one comes out soon. Either way, thank you again. Have a wonderful day.